I'm happy to welcome you. My further responsibilities are to introduce the Tanner lectures and then the person who will introduce the Tanner lecturer. So the Tanner lectures on human values were endowed by Grace Adams Tanner and Obert Clark Tanner in 1978. Obert Tanner was a professor of philosophy at the University of Utah, but in an unusual move for a philosophy professor, he also made lots of money through a company he founded that made commemorative jewelry, including, this isn't quite jewelry, but including the medals for the Salt Lake City Olympics in 2002. The Tanners were generous philanthropists. They endowed public fountains, philosophy libraries all over the country, including a splendid one here at the University of Michigan. And their trust funds Tanner Lectures 9 places, parallel series annual lectures across the globe. 2 in Great Britain, Clare Hall in Cambridge, Brasenose College in Oxford, and here in the United States, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford, Berkeley, Utah, and last but not least, Michigan. Among their charitable endeavors, the Tanner Lectures were particularly close to the heart of the Tanners. Let me read from a document by which Obert and Grace Tanner endowed this lecture series. They write, "Appointment as a Tanner lecturer is a recognition of uncommon achievement and outstanding scholarly capabilities in the field of human values. Tanner lecturers are international and intercultural and transcend ethnic, national, religious, or ideological distinctions." Later on in the document, Professor Tanner writes, "I see the lectures simply as a search for a better understanding of human behavior and human values. This understanding may be pursued for its own intrinsic worth, but it may also eventually have practical consequences for the quality of personal and social life." Okay, it's a pretty tall order. In order to fulfill it better, here at the University of Michigan, we try to extract every last intellectual drop out of the Tanner lecture, in particular by the next morning having a Tanner symposium, where we bring scholars from diverse backgrounds to comment on themes presented in the lecturer. Tomorrow's symposium happens between 9 and 1 tomorrow, upstairs in the Rackham Auditorium. The symposiasts are going to be Professor Jeff Ely of the University of Michigan History Department, Professor George Steinmetz of the Sociology Department here at the University of Michigan, and Professor Michael Warner of the English Department at Yale. Okay, and now that's the Tanner lectures. To introduce the Tanner lecturer, we have Terry McDonald, Dean of the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts at the University of Michigan.
Thank you, Laura. I'm glad to be here, first of all, to say thank you to the Tanner family, whose members I have met, and their generosity to us and many other universities, and their extraordinarily intellectual pursuit of interests has been something we're very grateful for and we've very much benefited from. I'm also very happy to be introducing Professor Craig Calhoun, director of the London School of Economics and one of the leading sociologists of his generation. And I'm happy to do that because I know Craig, and many of us know Craig. If there was, in fact, an external faculty of the University of Michigan, Craig would be on it. He's been a consistent colleague, interlocutor, co-author, conference attender, summarizer of brilliance on this campus many, many times, and so it's a great pleasure to have him here with us again today. He's a creative scholar who has also profoundly embraced the role of public intellectual. He has long been a bridge between European social and political theory and the English-speaking world. In a half-dozen major books and more than 100 articles, Craig has shown how social and political theory can be brought to bear on matters of active, vital concern in areas as diverse as protest movements, technological change, responses to disaster and terrorism, nationalism and globalization, the legacy of empire, the dialectic between religion and secularism, and the politics of identity. His historical writings have challenged received views about the role of class struggle in the contestation over industrialization in Europe, and in his well-known work on critical theory, itself one of the most important developments in political theory and philosophy on the 20th century, Professor Calhoun has not only provided a clear and accessible articulation of central themes of this movement, but has shown how its ideas can be developed and extended to renew their relevance to the world today. A central concern of Jürgen Habermas, a leading figure in critical theory, is how to create the conditions for undistorted communication among differing individuals. Calhoun's own work attests to the importance of communicating across differences. Born and raised in the United States, he has addressed issues affecting all corners of the globe, and he has taught in China, France, Eritrea, Sudan, Norway, the United States, and England. Dedicated to promoting the scholarship of others, he served as director of NYU's Institute for Public Knowledge and was president of the Social Science Research Council from 1999 to 2012. Professor Calhoun recently assumed the directorship of the London School of Economics, an appropriate successor to the school's founders, Beatrice and Sidney Webb, preeminent political, social, economic, and cultural critics of their time, with the same broad-ranging interests and intellects and commitment to public service and the widespread dissemination of knowledge for the betterment of society. The list of his honors and accomplishments would keep me busy much longer, but that would only forestall what is today the most important and the reason you are all here, to hear Professor Calhoun illuminate for us the principles and practices, potentials and threats of the public sphere, conceived not as a static entity, but as a complex and dynamic interaction among individuals not known to one another, and yet capable of shared ways of acting and living. It's a remarkable thing. And now I present to you a remarkable thinker, Professor Craig Calhoun, who will speak on publicness and its problems. Craig?
Well, thank you all for coming. I thank Laura Rishke and Terry McDonald for the wonderful introductions and the honor of being here. I'm grateful to the Tanner family. I was already grateful because I've read a variety of Tanner lectures in the past and profited and learned from them, and therefore felt suitably intimidated when setting out to prepare a Tanner lecture. I also imagined that the audience would be entirely composed of professors of philosophy, primarily analytic philosophers, and that they would be devoted to parsing every sentence of my talk for its possible truth values and failures to contain meaning. Despite that inhibition and intimidation, I have managed to produce a talk, and I think that it is a poor rise to the occasion of this magnificent room, which is itself now, in the booking of this room, testimony to the ambition of the philosophy department. But it's fortunate that, as Terry says, I have many friends in Michigan, and thank you all my friends for coming out to the talk. Let me begin by explaining a feature of the talk, its title, and the peculiarity of the title. The title has, as a core word, a sort of ugly word. I didn't entitle the talk "The Public Sphere," and I will explain why, but use this not quite word, publicness. And the reason is partly a kind of homage still to Jürgen Habermas and the discussion about the public sphere, to which Terry McDonald just alluded, but it is also to try to shift an aspect of that discussion. The spatial metaphor for a non-spatial phenomenon has, I think, often been a problem in discussions of the public sphere, and not just of the public sphere, but of a variety of related issues over time. The root of this, I think, is just as much an understanding of the private sphere as of the public sphere. Ian Shapiro wrote some time ago of negative liberty, which had become the standard view of freedom in the liberal tradition, and which was, he said, a view of a private sphere surrounding a person that cannot be entered, first by other individuals and eventually by the state, without his consent. This view of being surrounded by a private sphere, having a sphere of your privacy, sets up one side of this spatial understanding of the public sphere. It fits very well, for what it's worth, with a Cartesian view of a sort of self-contained individual. That is, this notion of privacy, man's home is his castle, one has his private sphere, fits very well with a notion of a person that is more or less self-contained in his or her body, and thus in that space, but very poorly with the notion of a person who is defined and energized and made possible by relations with other people. So that notion of privacy is in some tension with other ways of thinking about the very nature of a person. The spatial metaphor implies also a kind of zero-sum competition between the public sphere and the private sphere. If one gets bigger, the other must get smaller. And it is, moreover, a kind of appendage to the original discussion of Habermas's great work the Strukturwandel der Öffentlichkeit, right, where Öffentlichkeit gets translated and still routinely gets translated as public, but arguably means as much publicness. It has a sense of publicness, the kite, in it in that sense. So I want to begin with suggesting we not think in terms of spheres, that we not think in terms of compartmentalizations of space, each separate from the other, and in various ways, including as I talk a bit about Hannah Arendt in a few moments, I'll suggest that there are interconnections between public and private that are important, that public and private may each be challenged in the contemporary era, and that talking about their reciprocal relationship may mislead us in thinking about some of the issues we face. We are not contained in a little sphere. We are not the man in the center of the Escher print. Privateness itself has a range of different meanings, and the public-private dichotomy is a protean one that has shaped lots of discussion, sometimes fruitfully, sometimes not. We should remind ourselves that privateness is not always and obviously the paramount virtue it is taken to be in some contemporary discussions. That the idea of privacy, the idea of the private, carries a root with the notion of privation, of deprivation, of absence. There's a reason why private is the lowest rank in the army, as opposed to a general officer or a variety of other higher and commissioned ranks. There's also a notion of deprivation of public or collective goods, the goods that can come from a position in a larger public. And I think there is a story, though I won't primarily set out to tell it today, of a kind of privatization of risk in recent years, which is significant. That is a celebration of the private that has taken place, extolling private property and the values of the private, has also been accompanied by an erosion in many kinds of risk management institutions. Pension funds in large corporations, a nominally private thing, as much as welfare systems provided by states. And we see people in many ways facing risks, if you will, privately, that is, as bare individuals or with their families, that have previously sometimes been organized in terms of social institutions for managing risks. If I were to tell that story, we would talk about moving from older social institutions, which did sometimes better, sometimes worse jobs, towards new institutions for risk management, and then their erosion, and challenges to them, and questions of what will happen. But the part of this that I want to evoke is only the reminder of the complicated character of the word when we talk about private or public in this. As I said, when we speak about something like corporate pension funds, which, for the younger ones of you, are something that used to exist in the United States. And there used to be a variety of very large business corporations which were relatively stable, which were not themselves commodities to be bought and sold in financial markets. And those corporations provided for their employees health care and other benefits, one of which was a fund to provide for those employees in their old age. I am only half joking, unfortunately, in describing this as a thing of the past. But the point is, it's something ambiguously private and public. You can say that it is a creature of a form of private property, and the organization of business corporations is generally thought of as a private property relation. But it is something eminently social, organized, often large scale, and in many ways connected to a public dimension of corporate life. That is, a public need that the corporation served, sometimes for tens of thousands of employees, or indeed hundreds of thousands, or in a few cases millions, but also of the corporation as publicly created. Corporations ambiguously both creatures of private contract and creatures of recognition by the state. So we have one of the many instances of a difficulty speaking only in the language of public and private. We can think about private space in households, the notion of the home. I already used the phrase, a man's home is his castle. This idea of home and family as a space protected from intrusion. You can think about the way in which gender relationships have been structured within this notion of the family, within a power relation and a structure, within a social imaginary of the private space, and the complexities of that, including the idea that for there to be workplaces outside the home was to go out in public into these usually privately structured workplaces. So that for women to enter the workforce in large numbers, as has happened over the era since World War II, but in a certain way since the Industrial Revolution in paid employment, was to move at once into a public realm of work and into a structure of private property relations that by the same act of going out to work. The issue of the self and of intimacy figures in this notion of privacy, and I'll come back to a part of that again in consideration of Hannah Arendt. The idea that we have an interior self, an intimate, private part of us that must be protected from the public, but that also is a respite from public life that we nurture inside, a compensation for all that we do in public. And of course, all these difficulties with how to think about property and private property. Private property was the guarantor of independence. So in classical thinking about the public sphere in the 18th century, and in Jürgen Habermas's treatment of that, which kicks off so many discussions, the idea of being independent was crucial to being able to be a full member of the public sphere, to be able to participate in public, to vote, and so forth, and generally independence was understood as made possible by property. Of course, highly unequally distributed, and with the irony that the independence was entirely based on being able to depend on others. Even then, and more now, independence was not a matter of individuals. It was not a matter of homesteaders plowing their own land. It was a matter of people who were able to command the labor of others, and by commanding the labor of others, by depending on others to declare themselves independent. So it was never quite simple autonomy, the privacy of that self contained in the sphere. The property-based independence was always enmeshed in dependence on a web of relationships with others, with wife and other family members in most cases, and with a variety of people who might be servants, slaves, employees, neighbors, and so forth. And this is all the more true today when the private property we speak about is property organized in terms of shareholding in large corporations and massive financial investments. And although I won't speak about that at length, in the background of your mind as we go through this, you should think about the financialization of capitalism over the last 3 or 4 decades. Now, this is something that I suspect is often on the minds of people in the state of Michigan, as capitalism has changed so much here. But I refer simply to the enormous abstraction and embedding of wealth into financial instruments. The simple way of remembering this is in the 1970s, a quarter of the wealth in the United States was in financial instruments of some kind, was financial assets, debt, credit, and so forth. By the beginning of the financial crisis, from which we have not yet recovered, 75% of wealth was. So we moved, just inverted the proportions that was held in any kind of real investment in the real economy and in finance. And one of the features of finance, many issues about that, but one of them is that finance is quintessentially interconnection. What finance is a set of interconnections among people, but interconnections not organized in the way we usually think of the public sphere, not conversations, if you will, but relationships of credit and debt, and more complex relationships like credit default swaps, in which I may guarantee your debt, or a variety of other kinds of relationships. This enormous expansion of finance was building a world of relationships, often very opaque, indeed so opaque that many of the people in the finance industry at the center of this, when the meltdown began 5 years ago, were not clear who their counterparties were. They knew they were enmeshed in a web of relationships. They were not clear with whom. It was a form of social interconnection, but precisely not public in the sense of the public sphere. This is instructive. Publicness, by contrast, has a range of different meanings of its own. Openness in the sense of transparency, openness in the sense of access and potential expansion, but also openness in the sense of exposure. And though I won't primarily focus on it today, one of the tensions in the idea of publicness is that we both extol it and fear it. That is, I'm in the business of supporting a public university, and I praise its public mission, right? But I'm also one of the many citizens who could be, in various ways, involuntarily outed by computer records of one kind or another, and identity theft and a host of manners of involuntary publicness and possible loss of privacy have to cloud our discourse and thought about the public. Publicness is also, as Michael Warner in particular has stressed, a matter of stranger sociability. It's a matter of our relationships with people that we don't know. Now, you'll note that those financial interconnections that I spoke about before are also with people we don't know. We have enormous, dense relationships that we cannot, in principle, put names to and know interpersonally, such as our savings being tied up in financial instruments. We also, though, enter into sociability, that is, into some kind of communicative relationship with a variety of people we don't know, or we don't know very well. Some of these are face-to-face interactions with people with whom we have no enduring or deep relationship, people we pass on the street, people we chat with for a few minutes while we're waiting for an airplane, trying to get from Newark to Michigan. No, sorry. Right? We have interactions, we have sociability, and this helps to underpin the public sphere, right? And then there are a gradation of other relationships, as I'll talk about in talking about John Dewey in a few moments, that link us in more complicated and indirect ways to people we don't know. But just think about it. You may or may not know your congresspeople and senators, right? You probably don't know President Obama. Maybe you shook his hand at a rally. But you have a traceable set of relationships, communicative relationships, including things like voting, possible campaign donations, but also a variety of communicative acts. You may have signed a petition, right? You may have gone to a meetup organized by Move On or some similar organization, right? There are a web of communicative relationships that extend us there. All the time, we are engaged in relationships that exceed family, community, and determinate organizational roles. So you may not be best friends with your colleagues in your department, but you know them in one sense. They are not strangers to you. They have a determinate relationship. But there are other people in your discipline, in the academic world, who exist, as it were, in principle to you, or only on paper, or only on the internet, or in a variety of ways available to some kind of communicative interaction, right? But not generally that which would be described as colleague, friend, or any other such formalized role. I'll come back to stranger sociability. We are, through this stranger sociability, enmeshed in a variety of shared relationships, collective affairs, what Hannah Arendt would call things that are held among us, right? Our efforts to achieve the public good, to solve public problems, become part of this. So we have political positions, but we also have views on the environment. We have projects like clean air, to which we relate in some sense as a project held amongst us collectively. So we have collective needs. And we communicate. We communicate to make choices, but, and this will be a central theme of my lecture, to think of the public sphere primarily in making choices, to think of it primarily in terms of judgment, is to miss much of where the action is. We are frequently worried about the public sphere. I am constantly worried. I'm constantly annoyed. I read the newspaper and it's terribly frustrating. I write about the public sphere and its wonders. I read Jürgen Habermas and it looks terrific, and I read the New York Times and it looks depressing. And if I read New York Post, it would look much more depressing. Okay? The public sphere keeps failing to measure up to an ideal of reasoned rational critical debate, judgment, and decision-making. Occasionally, we're pleasantly surprised. The people at large turn out to have better judgment on some issue than our politicians appear at the beginning to have in Congress. But we miss something if we focus always on that issue of judgment. Moreover, we invite other arguments famously in American history associated with Walter Lippmann, but made until the present day, which says that if what we want is good, reasoned judgment, we should better depend on specialists. We should depend on some smaller group of people who know a lot more than us, who can focus on this full time because they don't have day jobs that compete with their public activity, and who can, in some detail, study the issues, and as a result, reach good decisions. What we miss, though, is not just those occasions where the people at large know better, but the way in which the public is crucial to change, which is much more a matter of cultural change than of decision-making, much more a matter of what's on the agenda, much more a matter of how we feel about it, how we perceive it, than it is a question of what is the right choice for this particular piece of legislation at this particular time. And that, in turn, depends very much on connections. Publicness, I want to suggest, is about the kinds of connections we forge with each other and about culture creation. And in that, to anticipate the very end of the talk, it's about the movements that bring about this change. Now, in most of the talk, I'm going to discuss John Dewey. This is a gesture to the University of Michigan, where he taught, and Hannah Arendt as two of the thinkers. I'll also say something about Jürgen Habermas, because it's actually forbidden to make a lecture on the theme of publicness without discussing Jürgen Habermas. But the point that I want to get to is one about which Dewey, to some extent, ignored, and Arendt was ambivalent, if not negative. The idea that movements and cultural change might be basic to the way in which the public sphere brings about change in all of this. So the theme is publicness in relationship, not just to privacy, but to all those other ways in which we're connected, and then the use of mediated communication, the action in public that can bring about change. Just briefly, right? We speak, again, I've said this already, of public and private as though when one expands, the other must shrink. I want to suggest, I'll draw on Arendt, who suggested the same thing, that it's often other things that are neither clearly public nor private, which when they expand, shrink both public and private. It is the growth of all of those indirect, opaque relationships like those in the finance sector that squeezes both public and private, I want to suggest, not simply the two squeezing each other. So large-scale social organization is a core issue to contend with here, and mediated communication, right, is either the devil or the angel we want to enlist on our side as we try to respond to transformations of scale and complexity. And this, I will suggest, has been going on the whole modern era and is going on now as we deal in matters of the public sphere. I'm going to talk about scale and complexity in relationship to three theories. This is in deference to the philosophical sponsorship of the lecture. John Dewey, who had an idea that I find extremely interesting and core to one that I'd like to think I had independently, although I'm pretty sure I had read Dewey before I had the book, what I called indirect relationships, but what he calls indirect consequences. So at the center of his book, The Public and Its Problems, is this idea of indirect consequences of action. We'll talk about Hannah Arendt and what she calls the rise of society, and very briefly about Jürgen Habermas and the public sphere. He alludes to the same issues of large-scale organization and transformation of society with the idea of system integration, that there are systems like the economy that work by non-linguistic steering media. The economy is steered by money, he suggests, following Talcott Parsons and Niklas Luhmann, and we intervene in it with linguistic means at our peril. Now, these are works from the 1920s, the 1950s, and the 1960s, for the most part, but things haven't gotten smaller or simpler or less integrated since then. And first, I want to talk about the Fort Worth Public Library. The Fort Worth Public Library, which I'm afraid to tell you I have never visited, is an interesting bit of testimony in this. Now, as I said earlier, I'm a fan of the public sphere. In the circles in which I move, indeed, the word public ranks with motherhood and apple pie. It carries an overwhelmingly positive connotation. My university is proud to declare a public mission. I support political candidates who promise to serve the public. I appeal to the public good when I argue for policies. I think we need a stronger public sector response to the calamity wrought by greed and speculation in the private sector. But possibly I am not typical. And the Fort Worth Library is my illustration. On June 11th, 2008, the Fort Worth Library, previously known as the Fort Worth Public Library, issued a press release unveiling its new identity. The press release described the library's new brand, complete with its logo. The makeover was intended to dispel memories of the, quote, serious and silent places you might remember from your childhood, in favor of a vibrant new environment with free Wi-Fi, movies, and even a popcorn machine. This bold new identity, as the press release called it, was made possible by a gift from the Gregory A. and Laura E. Bird Foundation and the professional services of Roby Graphics, Advertising, and Design. The director of the library, and note that she's not called the librarian, the press release makes clear that's also an out word. The library director, right, Glenise Robinson said, "The word public has been removed from the name of the Fort Worth Library. Why? Simply put, to keep up with the times. In today's day and age, the word public implies a place that at one time might have been viewed as institutional and restrictive. All are welcome at the Fort Worth Library. By removing one word with a potentially negative connotation, the library aims to appear more welcoming and accessible to all." She went on to say that a main goal of the new identity package was to help people understand that the 21st library is a dynamic mix of people, collections, and services. She told readers about the compelling, timely, and welcoming logo. I leave it to you to figure out how that logo tells you it's about a library. But they did pay quite a lot of money. The press release goes on to describe the selection of Bauer Bodoni as the official typeface of the Fort Worth Library to provide a, quote, classical and positive, close quote, contrast complementing other typefaces that might be found on some of the library's holdings. The press release explained the library's name change, I just quoted that, in the evocation of the restrictive, negative characteristics of the word public. This is a sobering story. In the first place, it simply reminds us of the rhetorical pit into which the notion of publicness seems to have fallen in the contemporary United States, and I fear not only the US. But two more specifics are important. And I have to say, I had to read this press release many times before I was able to generate any interpretation other than amusement or contempt. But first, there is the prominence of promotional culture in the Fort Worth Library story. By promotional culture, I mean the mix of public relations and design and the whole effort to promote certain ways of looking at things. It's the same thing as the fact that Bono or Madonna have promoters, and that politicians have press agents and managers and electoral advocates. There's a promotional culture, and ours is a promotional culture in which even high school students seeking admission to the University of Michigan are enlisted in this self-promotional culture to make and remake themselves by having extracurricular activities to list on their CVs and to promote themselves in their representation to the university. The press release of the Fort Worth Library both manifests and describes the use of design, advertising, and public relations techniques to try to shape a public response. It's like a postmodernist novel that talks about itself in the writing of it. That is, it tells you in the press release what your response should be to the press release. Indeed, this highly developed promotional culture is an important feature of the public sphere today, and one that should call many of the traditional ideas of transparency in face-to-face communication into question. There is no public sphere at the scale of democracy that we care about that is based on transparency without mediations that are influenced by this promotional culture. We need to keep that in mind when we think about it. From the logo to the official typeface, the Fort Worth announcement reflects an emphasis on design rather than substance that has long been characteristic of consumer marketing, but also more specifically, the infatuation with design that grew alongside neoliberal financialization in the last 30-some years. That is, you will remember fins on General Motors cars. We are in Michigan. But you should also be aware of a great new relevance of design in the contemporary world. The marketing of iPods and iPads, the design-intensive industries, the idea that this is one of the hottest fields in which you can go into. Indeed, I am told, the best source of employment now for anthropologists, since anthropology itself seems to have dried up in opportunities, but nonetheless, there is a great need for people to observe responses to design and to feed that back into a continuously iterative design process. And lest you think that is only about iPads and similar devices, it is, of course, about all sorts of things. There are anthropologists employed by MasterCard to redesign its relationship to its customers. And there are a host of other examples of this kind of design thinking. Design makes for attractive objects. I, too, have been seduced by iPads and iPhones. In fact, I'm feeling a bit odd right here. My iPad is down there somewhere, and I want to reach for it. But design has become a direct competitor to rational critical public discourse. From Cass Sunstein's relatively benign book, Nudge, to the borderline fascist fantasies of Peter Sloterdijk, design appears as a way to bypass conscious human choice in achieving possibly desirable ends. Most of the things that Cass Sunstein, lawyer and political theorist, advocate, and former Obama administration official, advocates in Nudge are perfectly plausible things, shifts in engineering everyday experiences to get people to do better things. But the advocacy as a whole suggests the end to persuasion, right? Certainly the end to an agreement between those who are planning what's going on and those who will be party to its life after planning. And the coming instead of an engineering of our behavior in public. It is literally an engineering approach to how to get people to behave in public. This isn't always bad, but it is worth noting the extent to which design thinking has not only promoted this, but presented it as progressive, almost radical. It has come to supplant political thinking in recent years. Instead of politics, we often get proposals for design. Instead of a so-called progressive movement, what we get is progressive use of design to try to improve the world in various ways. Second, still on the Fort Worth Public Library. Second, there is the almost comic but also tragic notion that the word public signals restricted access. Much as we might wish to dismiss this out of hand, we should pay attention. There has always been a hint, an ironic hint, of exclusivity or hierarchy in appeals to reasoned public deliberation as the way to improve public policy. This figured in Habermas's classic account of the public sphere as an arena of informed debate. Habermas's book revolves around a tension between the commitment of the public sphere to openness and the quality of rational critical argumentation. That is, the late 18th century animators of the public sphere said that there should be argument open to all, open in all of its characteristics as argument. But when that was realized, many people came into the public sphere who debased the quality of argument. And moreover, as it grew in size, as it became more open, it was more amenable to administrative management techniques. Public relations agents, survey researchers, various other projects could be introduced to manage public opinion. And so openness turned out to be, in some ways, the enemy of rational critical deliberation in the public sphere. The last section of Habermas's book charts what he sees as the degeneration after expansion, brought in organized management of public opinion and in breaching the division between public and private. 40 years before Habermas, much the same issue was central to the famous debate between Dewey and Lippmann, to which I alluded to before, to which I'll return, right? The questions are very current ones. They have become more acute, not less. Now, libraries were expected to figure in a project of self-education. This is what Dewey suggested against Lippmann. Lippmann said, we need to rely on experts. The public just can't handle public affairs. And Dewey said, well, the public will be able to after it goes through a process of self-education. That's what democracy is in part. It is the process of self-education as the public improves itself. Right? And indeed, libraries, actually bookstores too. I was going to mention bookstores, but I understand there are none in Ann Arbor anymore, so it would be an unfamiliar reference. Libraries' old role in self-education may be one of the associations the Fort Worth modern librarians seek to dispel. That libraries are for those people who want to embrace the project of self-improvement, and thus not for all of us. And there is a sort of sober, serious image to self-improvement. It's what the good kids did in school, right? They went to the library, they studied, right? I actually spent much of my childhood in libraries, loving them, enjoying this, so I will insist that self-improvement can be a pleasure, that the Deweyite vision of empowerment through self-improvement is real, and the projects of libraries, of absorbing knowledge, of becoming able to enter the public arguments, the public spheres, are serious and real options. But I think we shouldn't forget that not all the kids went to the library quite so often, and that the project of self-improvement was experienced by many as a criticism of where they were before the improvement. You need some self-improvement, young man. Right? The idea of self-improvement figured in Andrew Carnegie's very philanthropic project of endowing libraries throughout the US. There is a sort of artifact, a residuum of a Carnegie library just a few blocks from here. The Carnegie project, right, included the Fort Worth Public Library. And I should take you back to the picture of the Fort Worth Public Library. Actually, the original Fort Worth Public Library was razed, and this is a reconstruction, but it was simply a smaller neoclassical building with columns supporting a portico. Almost all of the Carnegie libraries in the United States participate in a design effort, a nudge, if you will, towards a certain view of how one should regard knowledge and how one should behave in the presence of books. Corinthian columns supporting a portico are a message. They are like the design work of the Apple iPad, only different, right? And we are much more intensive about this, but it wasn't absent from the earlier period. The self-improving project, right, was a message about serious stuff. And indeed, the columns remain an iconic design feature even in the new, more informal branch libraries built by the no longer public Fort Worth Library. Now, even in Dewey's radical democratic proposal, therefore, there was an implicit suggestion that to achieve democracy, the public needed to be committed to a project of self-improvement. It wasn't quite ready, and I'm going to explore that a little bit further and its implications. What this means, though, is that it's entirely possible that criticism, my own criticism that I immediately leapt to of the Fort Worth Public Library and its criticism of publicness as institutional and restrictive, has some merit, at least a grain of truth. Now, let me make clear, I think mostly it's silly, but I also think that it's instructive, right? And part of what it instructs us about is that implicit hierarchy in the way access to knowledge has been organized, right? When I was growing up, I thought of those public libraries, when I went to, as being public, most of all in the sense of being free, and the fact they couldn't turn you away. Now then, of course, there were public universities, which were once free and once couldn't turn you away. But this changed, right? Higher education was reorganized in a hierarchical structure, which meant that being able to attend the public university meant being chosen as in an upper part of a class, or possibly a highly selective, indeed national elite, so that the message about access to that public benefit of knowledge and the possibility of self-improvement was partly just work very hard while you're in high school, but partly that it is implicitly hierarchical, and if you're not going to get to the top, and you're only going to get to the branch campus, right, then you're not going to have the full capacity to participate. Right? So the Fort Worth librarians weren't articulating this, but they were partly on to a way in which the idea of public was being transformed in our very practices, including the practices of what we persisted in calling public higher education, which we organized in new ways. But in addition, there was something else in that message, which wasn't so benign. It was that there had been a campaign against publicness in the United States, and to some extent internationally, for decades. There had been a campaign among followers of Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman and others, extolling the idea of private, not just as good, but as natural, as automatic, as the only coherent way to be. Publicness was artificial. Anything public was put together artificially, whereas that which was the creature of the spontaneous activity of private individuals was natural. Read markets, as though that's how market worked. The book, The Great Persuasion, is a flattering portrait by a historian of this campaign. My point about including it is, think of the title. It was a public campaign. It was a movement to change ideas. It exemplifies part of how the public sphere works. This anti-public, anti-political movement was, in another sense, intensely public, using the resources of the public sphere, using the techniques of persuasion, using the mass media, using the kind of extended face-to-face media, clubs that were founded which would then spread knowledge to others, introducing the idea of the importance of the private sphere into religious prayer breakfasts. It's, by the way, not a concept that exists as such in the Bible, but nonetheless, it became part of innumerable Wednesday morning prayer breakfasts for Christians around the country, thinking about the meeting point between their religious beliefs and their economic practices, and indeed their politics. The book, The Great Persuasion, says that it tells, and I quote, the heroic tales of how the great men triumphed over ignorance and cant. This is the account of how the ideas of Hayek and Friedman and so forth triumphed. I will add, this is by a professor of history at Johns Hopkins University. This is not by some sort of obscure figure. How did Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, Lionel Robbins, LSE man, Milton Friedman, and the rest of the free market rump convince a world besotted by John Maynard Keynes that big government, in the immortal words of Ronald Reagan, was the problem? Okay? Well, it's an interesting question how that happened, but the answer is it happened by a social movement in public, not a mass movement exactly. It wasn't mainly membership that defined this. It included money, the backing of a number of wealthy conservative philanthropists, but it included organization and action in public. It included politicians, it included academics, it included a variety of other thinkers. Now against this, I told you I'd have to mention Jürgen Habermas. Jürgen was standing up for the public, right? Lone warrior? Not quite, right? At first in this period, and it was really since the 1970s that this campaign for the private accelerated, there were a lot of people standing up for the public, though somewhat inchoate about it. Habermas introduced this idea of the public sphere, open, albeit based on prior formation. Note the signal here that goes back to the change of the public university. Anyone can enter, but only if they have been adequately formed into a proper reasoning individual by their previous experience, and then are independent. Rational critical, that would become another contested terrain. Where does the rational critical stop, and opinions that are not quite rational start, when people become too radical or otherwise? It would suspend status, right, in the internal arguments of those in it. It was part of the civil society, but organized in the public good. And this was supported by a sort of social imaginary. I'll borrow the phrase from Charles Taylor, among others, but suggest that the way in which this rational critical set of procedures for democratic public debate worked was by inculcating a sort of imagined set of practices, a set of images of what the public sphere was like. It started from 18th century salon culture and moved forward in a shifting set of images for the way in which a proper public worked. It included being properly dressed, for example, in this 18th century picture. And that would matter, because part of the story I've just told in a book, The Roots of Radicalism, is the story of the expulsion from the public sphere of a variety of artisans and others who didn't live up to its increasingly exclusive self-understanding or imaginary. Habermas takes as an ideal the late 18th century, which did have a flourishing public debate, many kinds, a debate in which, in the British London example of it, someone like Thomas Paine shared the public sphere with someone like Edmund Burke. And both wrote important, eloquent texts, gave speeches, debated with each other. But to become what Habermas called the bourgeois public sphere, it was necessary for the public sphere to expel Paine. So by the early 19th century, the public sphere of more or less respectable opinion no longer included someone like Paine, the child, a former apprentice staymaker, right, a working class figure. Right? It included only people, right, who were proper and respectable. And for the next 30 years, and indeed longer, radicals insisted they were fully capable of the independence of mind required to participate in the public sphere. Pointed out, for example, that Burke was, after all, an employee, a hired, he was the client, right, of a marquis who was his patron. Right? So that he was hardly an independent voice, right? Whereas a variety of small owners of newspapers and others were much more independent voices. Someone like Thomas Wooler or Cobbett would come into the public sphere as figures asserting their greater independence. And yet, despite this, they were largely excluded. They found followers. This produced what would later get called a counterpublic. I'll come back to that. But it's worth noting that the bourgeois public sphere, the public sphere of the ideal, was always hierarchically organized in relationship to selective admission of various kinds. We have other imaginaries of the public sphere. When we talk about action in public, we have other ideas, and complicated ones. We don't know whether that supposed anonymous hacker, or at least anonymous poser in this case, is actually a public figure or not. Right? On the one hand, he's a descendant of the anonymous letter writers of the 18th century that Michael Warner has talked about. The mask has a similar meaning. On the other hand, he's taking direct individual action, if he's actually using hacking, and leaks to try to organize an intervention into the public sphere, which will possibly create involuntary publicity for some, right? He's not simply trying to work directly by persuasion. And it's unclear what organization and how transparent and public the organization, anonymous, can be seen to be. So there are a lot of questions for the Habermasian public about scale, about inclusivity, about its pluralism and who it's open to, about organized interests and professional manipulation, all the things that depress Habermas in the end, and about isolating rational critical debate from culture and expression. Can the public sphere really work by reason alone, or does people's thought always have more cultural context and cultural influence? So, does the field of publics accomplish some integration? Yes. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time, but what I want to suggest is that one of the things that goes on, I'll claim this again later, is simply that there's lots of connectivity. Whatever the quality of the decision-making, the discussions, and the public speech, one of the things that publicness does is connect us to each other. This is important in and of itself. But let me turn to John Dewey, my Michigan connection here. In The Public and Its Problems, this influential 1927 book of Dewey's, I take as central, he quotes Woodrow Wilson. As far as I can tell, he quotes him indirectly from Graham Wallace. He doesn't actually go to the Woodrow Wilson text, but it's indicative. There are a number of people saying roughly the same thing in the first third of the 20th century, right? Really from the 1890s to the 1920s. It's a commonplace to comment on the expansion of industry, the expansion of government, the expansion of railroads and telegraphs, the speeding up of society. Wilson says, yesterday, and ever since history began, men were related to one another as individuals. Today, the everyday relationships of men are largely with impersonal concerns with organizations, not with other individuals. Dewey allows that this is not strictly true, that it's an exaggeration, but says that it is basically true. Okay? We've had a shift from directly interpersonal to impersonal, organizationally mediated relationships. This leads Dewey to his core theme in The Public and Its Problems. He takes his point of departure, he says, from an empirical fact. It's just an empirical book. You'll see that there are normative and idealized statements woven in, but he says it's purely empirical. His point of departure comes from the objective fact that human acts have consequences upon others. And some of these consequences are perceived, and their perception leads to subsequent effort to control action so as to secure some consequences and avoid others. The public consists of all those who are affected by the indirect consequences of transactions to such an extent that is deemed necessary to have those consequences systematically cared for. Now, there are a number of questions. Who deems it necessary? Right? What kind of systematic care is involved? But this is the logic that would suggest that the public must grow beyond face-to-face communication, beyond local communities, grow to a much, much larger scale in order to cope with the range of consequences of action. For the action is now building factories and trading globally, or was in 1927, and is now global financialization that I alluded to before. Massive, intensive, large-scale interconnection of each of us, right, on a scale that has no public to match it at present. So the question is, how can the public catch up? We might say, well, you can found regulatory agencies in the government, and Dewey'd actually be quite fine with that, right? So that there ought to have been more regulation of the financial industry on our behalf, though almost all examples of that we've seen are expertise, not public sphere. They are Lippmannite examples, if you will, of the people who are relative elites deeming it necessary, including some of the people in industries themselves deeming it necessary for there to be care systematically for the consequences. In the case of the financial industry's dramatic expansion, this was accompanied by deregulation and failed regulation. That is, as there was this enormous financialization, much of the new kinds of activity fell outside the scope of old regulations, and new regulations were not created for hedge funds and so forth. And others, there were deregulations, like the repeal of Glass-Steagall, though that was really the sort of final bit of a deregulation that encouraged interstate banking and the merging of commercial and investment banking and otherwise contributed to this. So the elites may not have done their job, the experts may not have done their job in all of this. But that's not the public sphere strategy. And the great public sphere question for Dewey is, if the public is everybody affected, how does the public become involved in taking care of this? Communication is the answer. Right? The question to which communication is the answer is the expanded scale of indirect consequences, but Dewey says there can be no public without full publicity in respect to all consequences that concern it. I won't bother to lay out the fact that there was, shall we say, not full publicity of all the consequences or even the reality of the financialization. Or again, says Dewey, the essential need is the improvement of the methods, conditions of debate, discussions, and persuasion. He sounds here just like Habermas, and yet we want to ask, is that entirely viable as a way to imagine dealing with something like global financialization? A good thing, possibly inadequate. Right? And Dewey sees some of this. He says, we've inherited town meeting practices and ideas, but we live and act and have our being in a continental nation state. He'll eventually go on and say, it's even expanded globally, right? How much more of a problem, right? We far exceed the capacities of face-to-face community. I had to work in all these comments about face-to-face community in order to point out that a University of Michigan professor coined the phrase. That Charles Horton Cooley is responsible for the idea of the face-to-face as a item of social science and now popular discourse. Now, Dewey thinks that behavioral science will help, and I will leave it to you to judge whether behavioral science did help very much. But his view is that experimental science is going to enable us to make a science of politics and a science of the public sphere that will, in fact, solve these problems of large-scale connection. Right? He does worry a little bit that the problems of the public sphere, however, are that the experts aren't altogether acting in the public interest. We seem to be approaching a state of government by hired promoters of opinion called publicity agents. A class of experts is inevitably so removed, though, from common interest as to become a class with private interests and private knowledge, which in social matters is not knowledge at all. Okay? And it's not knowledge at all for an important reason for Dewey. Right? It's knowledge in the sense of knowing how to manipulate public opinion, possibly even rig an election or something, but it's not knowledge of a crucial kind because it's not knowledge of where the public hurts. He uses a famous analogy that only the wearer of a shoe can tell you where it pinches or whether it pinches. Right? But it still requires a shoemaker to fix it. So he gives expertise some do, it needs a shoemaker to fix it, but the knowledge is incomplete without the wearer of the shoe telling you that it pinches and where. Now, of course, we still are left with questions. Is the response to a public opinion survey enough reporting of the pinching shoe? Okay. Does there have to be discourse in public in which different shoe wearers discuss the pinches and identify possibly larger and more complex patterns of pinching to complement their individual concerns? But in any case, do we expect behavioral science to help? The questions that are at issue here are more or less Durkheimian questions. For the sociologists and anthropologists in the audience, they are questions that Durkheim took up in the division of social labor, right? The questions about scale, of interdependence, about whether it was necessary for societies to be knit together by common knowledge or only where they'd be sufficient if they were interdependent to have the knowledge of the interdependence, even if it didn't produce common knowledge for everyone. Dewey extols railways, travel and transportation, commerce, the mails, telegraph and telephone, newspapers that create, he says, enough similarity of ideas and sentiments to keep the thing going as a whole, for they create interaction and interdependence. I think that's a proposition, not simply a fact, right? Durkheim would have suggested that that mere similarity isn't adequate to the task of integration in a large-scale society. Dostoevsky, I thought rather nicely, and actually 47 years earlier in the Brothers Karamazov, puts the line in someone's mouth to say that some will claim that the world is gradually becoming united and it will grow into a brotherly community as distances shrink and ideas are transmitted through the air. Alas, you must not believe that men can be united in this way. Okay? So, a question, the late 19th, early 20th century, and a question today, I think, of whether there can be an integration of the public sphere adequate to the scale of interconnections. Dewey, in an odd turn in the end of his book, winds up longing for local community. That is, he ends up, and I won't read out all the passages, sort of saying, well, but this large-scale community can never be quite as good as local community. It can't be neighborly. It won't have the virtues of face-to-face communication. It's got an attenuated reach, and there's something to that. He says democracy must begin at home, and its home is the neighborly community, and there's something to that. Right? But there's a fundamental question here about how to connect different senses of community, this local and the large scale that he seeks. He has two senses of community in mind. A community big enough to match what Graham Wallas called the Great Society. That's not a phrase from Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson picked it up from Graham Wallas, for what it's worth. Right? The Great Society, right? The huge society, knitting together in complex ways enormous populations, even if still they're imagining national, not world society, widely dispersed, metaspatial, connected by media and organizations. It must be matched somehow by some kind of community, Dewey says. Right? Parsons called this the societal community in another unsatisfactory phrase. But the idea that there would be some sort of communicative, solidary structure of a similar scale to that huge society. But then, is that in any sense the same as a local face-to-face community? It seems to me not really. It's something else. We need to think about what it is. We need it because there is no way to match that society, but we can't get there through the local community. Now, for a few minutes more before I finish, I want to mention Hannah Arendt. Not just because she looks so much cooler than Dewey in the picture, but Arendt suggests the public is made by action. There's an immediate problem with her theory, which I'll come back to, which is that this notion of action is that it's rare and it's heroic and it's terribly elite and it can only be undertaken by people who aren't burdened by other sorts of responsibilities of everyday life, like jobs. So it excludes a lot of people from the potential to be actors. But it points up something about action, action which is words and deeds and promises, and an ability to change the world through changing how we think about the world that is important. Now, she starts out by saying that the occasion for her discussion of public is, in fact, what she calls the rise of society. The chapter on the public in The Human Condition immediately follows a chapter on the rise of society. Society, she says, threatens both public and private. Society is all of those statistics and bureaucratic organizations and impersonal relations. We've seen various other references to this. I won't go on. For her, it's particularly the egalitarian features, partly because I think she's not at all egalitarian, but partly because she sees in the egalitarianism something else, which is a process of commensuration and aggregation. That is, she sees in this the idea of common metrics that can commensurate measures of others and aggregation, right? So that she's aware of differences in wealth, for example, but the whole point to her is that for class or for inequality to be defined by differences of wealth starts with the common denominators. All people are more or less the same. Wealth is measurable by a common metric, and therefore we can just talk about differences of wealth as accidental attributes of these common people, as opposed to a more aristocratic notion of the essential differences of persons, which she's after. She thinks privacy has undergone its own revolution, that in the modern era there has been a new invention. Old privacy was mere housekeeping. This grows into society, but a new kind of intimacy grows. And some of this is about love and connections to other people in personal and intimate ways, but a lot of it is about what Charles Taylor elsewhere calls the affirmation of ordinary happiness. It is about people finding small ways to be relatively contented in their gardening, with their pets, in bringing a flower from the garden inside, in their interior decorating, right? The proliferation, and she sees it as a sort of odd kind of partial publicness of ordinary life. It's not public in the sense of being action that matters. It doesn't really organize the world. It is an expansion of what is relatively unimportant for her, private life, to the very large scale. And what we have is that going on, drawing the attention of people instead of politics, and the expansion of this bureaucratically organized, statistically mediated society. And so real privacy is getting squeezed. And for Aristotle, she leans on Aristotle, and she always makes the point, which is a widespread way of reading Aristotle, that Aristotle equated the privacy with idiocy and necessity. But actually, Aristotle also saw it as a realm in which people cultivated virtue. And so the private was a place in which people cultivated their own distinctive virtues, as distinct from entering into public. So that gets squeezed. And so does the public for Arendt, since there's not much room anymore for public action. So society pushes both out. And she comes to a point where she uses a metaphor of the table. And she says that the public is like a table that we sort of sit around, the limited metaphor. It enables us to hold amongst us something in common. And one's not sure whether it's a seance or a dinner, but in any case, the people around the table are related by the table. They sit across, and they are connected and related, but they are differentiated. They're at different places, and she tries to grope for differentiation and relation going on at the same time, enabling us to hold public things amongst ourselves. And that means basically civilization, right? It means that we are able to create out of words and deeds, out of history and memory, out of promises, right, to each other, something civilized that we hold together, and that this is what we must vest our hopes in. Now, Arendt's account of the social is described by Hannah Pitkin famously as the attack of the blob, evincing at once cheesy horror movies and a sort of 1950s mass society critique, which Arendt was indeed participating in. The idea that society was just doing this was happening as an almost alien force in Arendt. Society was taking over, pushing out the public and the private. It was an undifferentiated mass. The word mass is used over and over again in the 1950s to describe this society, and it's actually been coming back, interestingly, after having been put almost out of usage by 1960s critiques, right? This society is counted, that is, we have statistics about it, but it's deeply not seriously differentiated, right? And human beings are constrained from their most human purposes by this. Corporation man on the one hand, right, and government on the other. It generates, in Arendt's phrase, behavior, not action. Modern people behave, they don't act. They behave in the sense that they can be controlled. Political science goes through a behavioral revolution in which it sets out to study empirically political behavior, fulfilling Dewey's desire for a behavioral science of politics, in order to be able to manipulate the behavior directly, not through big political ideas. That is, not through a large-scale discussion of what kind of civilization we want to build or something like that. This is linked to a fear of social movements, for Habermas in many ways as much as for Arendt, or not as much, but in the same way, right? And the social movements field of study that sociologists and political scientists will know hadn't yet come into its own at this period. What was going on in the 50s and 60s, and indeed before, was the study of collective behavior. The apogee of this work was Neil Smeltzer's 1962 book on collective behavior. The idea was that there was a crowd psychology at work, which took people to the lowest common denominator. If they were acting collectively, then they merged with others at that lowest common denominator. And there was a short-circuiting of social processes, because to be involved in a protest at once revealed some short-circuiting in the functioning of society, but it revealed a short-circuiting in your mind about how to deal with the larger problems of society, which should be through the usual conventional politics, what we used to call in the 60s, reasonably enough, the system. And so this brought mass explosions, not real politics. Movements were to be feared because they were upheavals, right? They were not real political discussions. But, and I want now to come to my conclusion that I foreshadowed at the beginning, perhaps movements are in fact the crucial means for conscious action to shape public culture, and it's culture that is the medium most shaped, not political decisions. Arguably, there is a field of publics. There's not a public sphere. I rejected the sphere metaphor and other bases before, but arguably what there are a variety of publics contending with each other, allying with each other, working together, working separately, having members move from one to the other, sharing skills and knowledge, right? This classic bourgeois public sphere that became bourgeois by getting rid of the artisans at the beginning of the 19th century was only part of public discussion. There was a religious discussion going on that was not very directly central to either the bourgeois public sphere, as Habermas described it, or the working class radicals, but was at least as big during that period of time. Right? There were multiple and contending public spheres. This is the beginning of, usually cited for much of modern feminism in the era of Mary Wollstonecraft and so forth. There are a number of different thematized public concerns, often in partially separate but overlapping conversations. So debate and sitting in judgment are at best only part of the story of the public sphere. Access and recognition are always asymmetric. That is, some people are always getting less access, being less well recognized. And therefore, there is no plausibility to a notion that says everybody is in equally and status disregarded, because the criteria for getting in and being heard are so asymmetric. So it's always necessary for people to raise issues of identity. A widespread view is that identity politics is something invented in the 1970s that has shaped things recently. People have said the big issue is I'm a woman, I'm black, I'm an immigrant, that the identity categories are key, but they were always key. This is what workers were saying 200 years ago. I'm a worker, and that really matters. I should not be excluded or forced to become bourgeois in order to participate. Right? That there was always an element of struggle over identity in this sense, about who could get in. This was part of a differentiation process. People were not willing to be the masses. They were claiming differentiated identities. What gets on the agenda and who gets heard is always a matter of a politics in part of movements, never of some pure arena of rational judgment. The phrase counterpublics was introduced by Oskar Necht and Alexander Kluge in a critique of Habermas, published almost immediately after his famous book, to try to talk about the fact that there was a proletarian public sphere, that there was contention. But it's worth recalling that there is always an ambivalence in these counterpublics, which could be described as a women's public. The 70s, 80s, second wave feminism could be described as a black public sphere, and has been, and so forth. The ambivalence is always between autonomy in the counterpublic and inclusion in the dominant public discussions. These are always campaigns for inclusion that are shaped by exclusion by elites. They are never simply campaigns for autonomy. Therefore, they are not simply solutions. In sum, then, movements and cultural change and connections are a large part of what we should see as core to public life, not just that better or worse public debate which we judge. And these don't require the same project of self-improvement. They may offer it. They may offer that very self-improvement, that education by virtue of democratic participation that Dewey sought. But the big difference is they are not about getting educated first in order to enter the public, and they are not about action to be achieved entirely on the model of scientific or other discussions reaching a correct conclusion. The actions will be collective, not just heroic individuals. They will necessarily link face-to-face community to large-scale organization, but not equate them. And they will transform culture. And this is a large part of what has to happen. So think of a politics, any political issue today. Think of the gay marriage issue that has been a big political issue in the last few years in the US. And imagine how this comes about. There are movements involved, certainly, right? Multiple ways of them doing different things. There is network density of people connecting the face-to-face to the large movement. Because of the gay movements, there are people who are out and identifiable as gay, and everybody knows them, right? Cheney knows his daughter, right? There's the whole sort of phenomenon that is a network interconnectivity that makes this part of the public sphere. There are decades of change in thinking that depend partly on large-scale media, partly on personal conversations and connections. There is a web of organization to structures of power. Think of log cabin Republicans, right? And the capacity to work there. And there is, of course, a public conversation, but not just the conversation of the last few years about particular bills, a conversation that has changed a culture in order to a culture where this phenomena can be discussed, can spread, and can even be criticized as, in fact, an adaptation to other cultural changes, because there was also a conservative pro-family movement over the previous 30 years, which helped to make the idea of marriage the right way in which to assimilate gay populations, as opposed to other possible ideas of how to be queer or what it might mean. The point, in other words, is that the public sphere does change things, could even change things at the scale of global capitalism and financial interconnections, but not by managing them, not by developing in itself the expertise to carry on the critical discussions, only by changing the way, in a larger sense, collectively, culturally, these things are understood and addressed, and enabling various kinds of policy and other attention to them. The public sphere is as crucially about connectivity and cultural change as about actual political decisions. I won't take the time to try to give another example, which would be to say Europe and the perennial question of the fate of Europe these days that I'm in. But the issue of the public sphere in Europe is not just the issue of what people say, it's who is actually in it. And what we see in the wake of the financial crisis is not so many people are in the European-wide discussion, that the discussion when the chips were down became an intensely national discussion, not a European discussion. And the connectivity is as much of the issue. So the reality of opaque webs of indirect relations and systems of impersonal, partially automated connections cannot be met by a longing for face-to-face community, but only by integrating face-to-face community with better versions of large-scale social integration and recurrent mobilization, including to change culture. Thank you.
This is an invitation for you to go on a little bit longer,
actually.
So it seems to me quite right that we have to understand movements as a part of this idea of the public, and that there's a different dynamic from the dynamic of, let's say, reason, judgment in an expert sphere. But I wonder if the contrast is that clear in a sense, in that part of what gets a movement going, gets it wide acceptance, and eventually makes it possible for it to succeed, is that it does advance visible reasons. And by the way that they live, perhaps by the way that they act in the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, gay rights movement, they actually put reasons in front of us in maybe not a discursive way, but often it was discursive as well. And so I'm just wondering if we don't want to take on some of the framing already of the idea that, well, there are movement-type processes and then there are deliberative processes. It seems that what you were suggesting at the end was friendly to the idea that this dichotomy is a bad inheritance of the way that the debate was structured in the 50s and so on.
Yeah. Well, I think you're absolutely right. Thanks for the question. You phrase exactly what I said, but said less clearly, I think, that from not just the 50s, but from a very long period of thinking about this, a division was made between the way a proper public would deliberate and consider reasons and make arguments, and popular activity, movements in particular. And that dichotomy, I think, has always been wrong. It was wrong in the 18th century, it was wrong in the 19th century, and it's in fact older than this. That dichotomy was present during the Protestant Reformation and was, in the English Civil War, right? So there's a very long-standing dichotomy. It's a structuring dichotomy of the modern era because it's tied up to the meaning of these ideas of public and private that become such protean structures for us. And the idea of independence and adequately formed opinion. So we have all of this baggage that tells us that these are different worlds. And it would take a lot of baggage because it doesn't make any sense to think they're completely different, right? So it reveals that there's been a lot of pre-forming of our thinking that we want to separate out deliberative public action and cultural change or movements or things like that as much as we do. It's deep, right? Separating conscious, rational thinking from the way culture changes, though, is a pretty deep, basic sort of idea, asking how they're related to that. But we're pretty clear that we can't just will cultural change by saying, I propose that henceforth, right? And so there are moments when activity plays a big role on that, in that, and produces some of that cultural change. There's lots of cultural change that doesn't have that kind of agency behind it. It happens, but there's much less steering of it by movements or other action than at other times. But precisely what I want to suggest at the end is that we give up the dichotomy, that we study the relationships, right? How people are connected, how some of that is argument and deliberation. And we are changed by having been a part of the same argument, even if we don't end up agreeing with each other. And we're changed into people that know each other in some sense, as well as by other kinds of cultural participation. So I think that the discussions of the public sphere have been much too heavily structured by the dichotomy and the boundaries around it. And that contributes to the Fort Worth Public Library problem. That is, it contributes to setting up public as this special thing to which others can only aspire. We could add to how much that's reinforced by visions of the government as merely gray and bureaucratic, whereas the exciting things are somewhere else and there's a larger story. But a part of that story is the unwillingness of a stream of otherwise wonderful and insightful thinkers to see movement activity as central to the way change will be produced.
If I can follow up on your use of the Fort Worth Library example, and in particular, maybe shed some light on this claim that the use of public might make the library seem less welcoming and accessible. So just a bit of armchair iPad research reveals Robinson, whom you quoted, was actually in 99 the first African-American elected as president of the Texas Library Association. So to put that in perspective, 97 years of white leadership before she was president, and that rebranding of the library actually went in tandem, just FYI, for the library with an introduction of Spanish language groups and programs and conversation groups. And so when I see this, logo with multicolored blocks be introduced next to the name of the library, I think, well, I'm inclined to actually just trust this claim that maybe the use of the word public wouldn't be very welcoming or accessible, or make the library seem welcoming and accessible to groups who have historically been excluded from public libraries, excluded from taking leadership roles in state library associations, and in particular to sort of a Spanish-speaking community who might be routinely denied or discriminated against in their pursuit of public services. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious about, whether you might comment on that, that sort of different perspective on the claim that the use of this word public would, not be welcoming to those particular groups. Yeah.
Sure. I think that's a really good point. And I knew Glenise Robertson was black. I didn't know about her role in the Texas State Library Association. I think that part of this is precisely the idea that the public, including the public sphere in the Habermasian sense and all this, but also public in the sense of state institutions, has a history of claiming an inclusivity it doesn't deliver, and being an agency of demarcation and exclusivity in an implicit way. So I think that saying it's just in and out is too simple, but it's right? So that the way in which a discussion is framed about minority languages or about African Americans and populations, so forth, and the in or out is part of it. I would suggest it's also this hierarchical organization. And it's not that class is hierarchical. All of these things are hierarchical. So the idea of a hierarchically organized entitlement to those things that are public, right, in which you get different qualities of them, separate but equal, you get different amounts of them, and so forth. The University of Michigan, Ann Arbor branch campus, right? You get different gradations, right? All of these things, I think, are of a piece, so that you give more clarity to part of what I said. My second thought. My first thought is, this is silly. How could public mean exclusive? But the second thought is, hasn't this whole conversation been organized in such a way that public in part means exclusive? So just as the public that Habermas takes to be his archetypal late 18th century public was excluding workers and so forth, all of these publics that have been legitimated have involved exclusivity. But then I wanted to go one step further and say the exclusivity gets contested by movements, not just by public discussion. The civil rights movement was not simply a conversation about whether there were good reasons to change. It included that, as the previous questioner said, but it was also a social movement in a broader way, and it was not just inside the dominant public sphere, it was contesting it from outside, but it was a contestation in part for inclusion, not simply for a separate black public sphere, and so forth. So that this is part of what led me in the direction of saying that we need to take seriously the lessons inscribed in this. And they are, I think, both the more positive one, which you're narrating, and I would say just there, and the more negative one. In this particular case, the Fort Worth Library, the donor, the financial donor for the renovation requested that the word public be removed in a recognition of the exercise of private wealth in this. And it coincided with the more benign reasons for being more welcoming. So we had sort of both things going on, which I think is often the case.
Greg, I was much taken with your focus on cultural change as an important element in this discussion. And the thought occurred to me certainly that one mechanism, certainly not the only mechanism, but one mechanism of cultural change is generational replacement. Obviously, we've seen by the example you gave of the changing views on gay marriage that cultural change can happen much more rapidly than simply by the mechanism of generational replacement. But assuming that generational replacement is an important part of cultural change, are there ways in which it occurs to you that public engagement leaves some kind of residue that's more likely to lead to the kind of cultural change that you see as an outcome of public processes? I'm not certain I understand if thinking about generational replacement, what the mechanism is, how it happens that public engagement leads a succeeding generation to look at the world in a different way.
Right. I'll try, and I don't have a particularly great answer to this. I think that generational replacement is very important. I think it is not a linear process in which you pick an attitude, you know, gun control or gay rights or anything else, and you just get more of it with generational change. There are a whole lot of things where I'll just say the same thing in a slightly reversed way. There's an unwillingness to change for most of us, and therefore people who grow up into something different find it easier. So, you know, automatic teller machines were invented and fully technologically available 20 years before they were implemented in a widespread way by banks, because the people with the money weren't yet willing to use them, essentially, and banks waited for another generation willing to use them. And I choose the example as it has very little ideological significance, the automatic teller machine. But I think it's the same thing with other things too, that the issue is the friction against change in most of us that enables a mechanism of change to be generational replacement. But then the question of what the next generation does, you know, the next generation after the 60s generation majors in business. It's not the same linear sort of pattern. And I think the questions of what shapes each generation, if indeed generations are strong sociological units, are still questions. It's not within a framework of simply progress or linear change. And one of the questions of that is what residues, for want of a better word, are left by public actions. One of the things, if you were following a strong idea of generations, a Mannheimian or other strong idea of generations, generations are marked by what were the big publicly thematized things, the Depression or the 60s protests or whatever. And the ways in which those do or don't leave legacies are very important. An additional dimension of publicness that I didn't talk about is the extent to which there is recording and continued availability of knowledge of these things. I studied one of the 1989 protest movements in China that led to the Tiananmen Square events, and one of the features about them, and about them still today, how little the students in 1989 knew about previous protest movements in China, and how little people today know about the Tiananmen movement, which relates to censorship and state control of available knowledge and so forth. So a completely different discussion of publicness is about the extent to which history is in some sense publicly accessible to continue to shape us. Or not, and how that's organized and how that's filtered through the way we represent it. Is history all Ken Burns specials on TV, or is it other, you know, forms and ways of thinking about the past? But I think that there is a big question about the extent to which any of these movements and phenomena leave their mark, and I think that's an important question.
Craig, thanks very much for this. I wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about the culture that changes, and in two senses. One is, does it necessarily or just secondarily include those artisans, and I would say those and artists too? Where's the role of the aesthetic here?
Sure.
And collective and individual forms of art. But also, on the other hand, in terms of, to talk about it in terms of the social imaginary. The slide of the 18th century gentlemen all gathered together surprised me as your image of the social imaginary because of your, you know, what I know of your other work on the social imaginary, which has always struck me as well, I really like it. Because your version of the social imaginary that I've encountered before has been a very creative force, not managed, unpredictable, dynamic. Charles Taylor tends to produce a sort of history of ideas version, and it's very much a trickle-down sense of change, okay?
Right.
That Locke has an idea, eventually it's kind of accepted without, it goes without saying.
Right.
So those two.
Okay. I think there are three. One of those harkens back to the question about the Fort Worth Library and the correct point that plurality and exclusion and the way in which the public sphere manages it is an issue. And it seems to me it's an issue if you just forget public sphere and say culture too, that there's the same sort of issue about that. But in relation to your two specific points, I think first, the aesthetic matters a lot, and it matters increasingly because mediation matters increasingly. So it's not that the aesthetic changes or gets better or something else, but the proportionate communication value, if you will, changes. The role of visual communication grows during the time period that I'm talking about. So I would say in that sense, the aesthetic grows. But there are strong aesthetic components throughout. So if I had tried to illustrate the social imaginary of the working class and the artisans during that period, I sort of cut slide that was going to do that, right? It would have been liberty caps on heads, but often on poles, and it would have been colors that were taken as signifying attachments. There was an aesthetic to protest and a visual communication in that as well. But it becomes much more constantly significant after photography and then on through. And so if we were talking about Tahrir Square and protest in Cairo 2 years ago, and we were talking about what's going on, and all the discussion of social media, the text is part of that discussion, but the visual image is huge. The videos of police brutality or something are huge, so that you have a role both of the visual generally and then of the aesthetically presented visual that matters a lot. And so I think this is very big. In terms of the question of creativity in the social imaginary, I take the criticism. What I was trying to represent was the imaginary that I think animated the public sphere. But you are right in that is animated the Habermasian image of the public sphere. That is, it was an imagined activity of well-dressed, gentle people in polite society. But you're correct to criticize because of a point that I think he would make as well, which is that imaginary included capacity to exceed itself. And the reason you get this history is it doesn't get stuck entirely in that gentle society. Some people who are entitled to get into that gentle society, Jeremy Bentham, for example, say that they also want to back the writings and views of Tom Paine and are prepared to invest in other projects that are not legitimate to the bulk of that polite society. And so there's potential both in, if you will, the groups because they're plural, and the imaginary because it is potentially reaching beyond itself, right? That part of the value of the concept of social imaginary that I didn't in any way bring out today is the capacity to imagine and then set about making real, or even indirectly, without consciously choosing it, to begin to make more real what you could imagine. So you could imagine more inclusivity than we have, and you can thereby bring it out. And I think that's an important point.
I was really intrigued by your European example that you hinted at the end of your talk, so I was kind of hoping that you could go through that so that we could listen to that part.
Well, that was an easy question. Sure, but let me be very short about it. The sort of core idea to this is that there is a huge industry studying the European public sphere and talking about it in the media and wondering where it is and trying to identify it. And it's one of the major indicators of European integration, right? So European integration is going to bring more public sphere. The thinking about the public sphere, it seems to me, recurrently fails to consider the public sphere as an organ of solidarity, as a means of achieving solidarity, and so continually positions it as an outcome of something else, that if only we were more solidary, we would have a better public sphere. If we could get rid of national language differences, we could do that. So that there's a big investment in Europe, in the Erasmus scheme of student exchanges, in the European framework grants to create different structures of collaboration, just to cite academic examples, and in all other sorts of ways of producing this. What isn't, I think, happening nearly as much as the European Union would like is the actual mutual engagement of Europeans around things European. That there's not a table, if you will, in the Arendt example, that for Europeans to sit around and hold things in common. And you see that very strongly in the basic law or constitutional debate, and first the defeats the referendum. You get a structure of trying to establish a constitution for Europe, Habermas and others. Habermas writes why Europe needs a constitution. So a big movement, we need a constitution. America has a constitution, we don't have a constitution, we need one, but we need to organize what will go on for our public affairs in Europe. A select committee chaired by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing is established to write this, and it comes up with a constitution that only an anarch, or at least a lawyer, could like. Right? It's hundreds of pages long. It goes into incredible detail about everything. And it does guarantee potentially lots of future income for lawyers interpreting the Constitution. But what doesn't happen is any sort of animating discussion. The constitutional moment is the opposite of a public discussion arriving at a constituting in an active sense. So the Arendtian image of the American revolutionary, post-revolutionary constitution, right, that there is a moment of we the people, we somehow do this. It's obviously stylized and figurative. It's not that there is one big mass meeting of all the American people or something, but the production of that narrative and the sense of capacity to say we the people is the biggest thing in this, in a certain way, almost net of the particulars of the legislation, the basic law. And the Europeans don't get that out of the constitutional process and are terribly shocked, the people put together, by the defeats in the referenda. When this is then put to people, and people say, doesn't sound like us, right? Thumbs down. And I think it's indicative of an issue in which there is recurrently an attempt to get the mechanisms right and the legal and institutional arrangements right in advance of this. Another very different kind of illustration. The anxiety over sort of common language in the US has some of the same character of English has to be. We have to defend English. We won't be able to have a public discussion if we have different languages. We must therefore defend English only in the US. Becomes odd in this sense, in that rather than animating the actual public engagement and generating it through multiple languages, if need be, you get this setting up of a prior imagined condition for it. And Europe does this in spades. So the Europeans don't watch the news in anything but their national languages, by overwhelming degree of statistical consistency. Europe is structured for most people in a set of restrictive labor laws and other things that minimize it. There is mobility, there is growing integration, but there's not a bottom-up view. Now, the account of this democratic deficit is get the constitutional structure right and we'll start fixing that. But what I'm trying to suggest is that these are cultural change issues, that what's needed is cross-national in the European terms, connectivity among people to get engaged in a common project of being the people of Europe that will then lead to the capacity to change bunches of these other things. So the order is all wrong in the way the discussion is usually analyzed. And it's the same time sort of saying about the US, and it's more true of Europe, which is a weaker solidarity than the US. But the action is in the connectivity and the project of being and changing the we of we the people more than it is in getting the specifics of policy right.
We have time for one more question if it's short.
The real thing is whether the answer is short.
Yeah, the question is short. I was intrigued by your quote from the Brothers Karamazov. In it, Zosima is expressing some skepticism that when ideas collide, it's a good result. And Dostoevsky has a lot of skepticism about that, too. Sometimes they collide in beautiful ways, but sometimes in horrific ways. And Dostoevsky thinks the same thing about movements. So I'm wondering whether you share that kind of skepticism, and if you do, what means you think ought to be taken to try to allow ideas to collide in a productive way rather than a destructive one.
Right. So I do and I don't, some parts of it. So I don't share the skepticism about movements. That is repeatedly there for Dostoevsky in lots of ways, although some are better than others, like everything could qualify that. I do share the notion that in and of itself, the collision of ideas will be the action, though I think collision, commingling, various relationships, things go on, and I'm not particularly worried about the collision the way that he was. But one of the themes, and it's not just in that quotation, is the sort of traveling and common denominator effect. So he's worried about collisions of ideas, I agree, but he's also worried about ideologies that suggest that the spread of ideas will become the basis of harmony in some sense. And that's, in a sense, the diffusion model is the thing that I'm skeptical about here most, and therefore citing him for. That was almost a short answer, Laura.
Okay, before inviting everybody to thank Professor Calhoun, I'm going to invite everybody to the Tanner Symposium tomorrow morning. The conversation will continue upstairs starting at 9. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Good questions. Thank you.